Okay, so with the BME 280 all finished for now, we can then turn to the rest of the board, and you will recall the color scheme that I have in the manual as far as the order in which I recommend that you make these solder connections. Remember, soldering does two things. It provides, first and foremost, electrical connections between the wire and whatever it's being connected to, and then also mechanical stability. Okay, so and the main thing that's also important to keep in mind when doing this type of work is that the shorter the wire, the better. Right? Longer wires will tend to pick up more noise, okay, and electromagnetic noise, which will lead to poor signal quality in some applications. So that's why sizing these jumper wires to the length that you need to cover, as specified in the manual, is generally a good idea. Okay, so what I've done here is I've removed the two boards we had originally as we had laid it out. I've removed the terminals as well, those black two-wire connection terminals. Okay, and then I've also removed everything that had a black dot for its connection in the manual for that figure. And so this is everything that had a green dot as a connection, which just indicates that you should make these connections first when you solder it up. Okay, it's not to say you couldn't do the black ones now as well, but the more that you have on the layout as you solder it up, the more there is to keep track of. So just doing it systematically can be helpful. Okay, and when you look at the bottom, you can see that some of these wires stick on through, particularly the resistors that I haven't trimmed yet. Okay, so those longer wires are the resistor wires, and I generally recommend that you bend them down so that, because we'll be soldering from the bottom side, so we'll be flipping this whole board over when you solder it up. Okay, so if you bend those wires, it'll help to keep them in place once you flip it over and make those connections. Okay. And the only other one to note is that this brown one here is also shown in green. This one we're actually going to solder on the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to eventually put this brown one on the bottom side of the board, and so that its pins are sticking up through it, and then I'll solder those pin connections on the top side of the board. Okay, and I'm doing that just so I have some more room, because eventually the BME 280 board is going to go right over it, and we're going to need a little bit of working space where this brown wire currently passes through. So I'll take this off and I'll position it at the bottom of the board when I go to solder that one. Okay, so I'll do everything on here first, and then I'll do this one, positioning it on the bottom, and I'll show you the result of all that once I'm done with that step. The one other thing I'll mention prior to soldering these up is to double check all of your pin connections, okay, to make sure that all your pins are connected to the right row and column as they're supposed to be in the schematic. Okay, and for example, I just noticed in my final check before soldering that this particular wire here that's supposed to go from row B, column 12, okay, and I had it going to column 14 as it should, but I had it connected to the negative or the ground connection line, okay, to that rail. So it's supposed to connect to the positive 3 volt rail, so I just moved that down to that proper pin. Okay, it's not to say that you can't make these corrections after the fact, because you can always desolder your connections. Okay, it just takes a little bit of extra steps. If you're going to desolder, I recommend using something that's going to suck up the solder. This is something here called a solder sucker. Okay, and basically you heat up that solder connection with a soldering iron, and then you position this next to it, and you get it ready to go. And this button here simply just creates a suction and pulls up that melted solder that you have, and pulls it up. And it may take a few tries to do that. Okay, so it's not a perfect solution, but if you need to make corrections, you can certainly do that. Okay. Luckily, I hadn't soldered that just yet. But what I had done is I had bent all my pins down to help hold them in place, so you can see what it looks like here to a certain extent. Okay, so just be careful when you flip it over. Some things might fall out, and you just have to be careful about putting them back in before you go to solder. Oh, there goes one right now. So I'll fix that, and then I'll solder these up. Okay, so I've got the result of that first set of soldering for all those green connections that are in the diagram there that I showed you before. Okay, and you can see that brown jumper wire, for example, is now positioned on the bottom. Okay, as I mentioned. Okay, this is another way of connecting those two positions. And on the bottom, you can see all those solder junctions. Okay, and I'm not going to cover soldering as part of these videos here for this weather station, but there's lots of tutorials and videos to watch online if you want some tips, if this is again something new for you. And the main thing is just to make sure that you have a good clean solder tip, okay, and you've got the right temperature to melt the solder and so on. What we'll eventually do, all these long wires that are sticking out here, primarily from the resistors, they're the ones with the longest wires, but then the jumpers, some of the jumper wires as well, have some long connections sticking through. And what we'll do as a final step is to go through and trim those all down, because again, you want those to be short, and you don't want anything to make connections electrically that's not supposed to. So as the very last step, we'll go through with our wire clippers and trim down all of those leads that are sticking through. Okay, but for now, that first step is done, and then we can move on to everything else that's labeled with those black connections. Okay, so we've got a few extra jumpers to connect through. Okay, and then another resistor. We have the 2.2 kilo ohm resistor that we need for the LED light operation. Okay, so we'll put that in there as well. Okay, and then finally we'll put in our boards and our terminals, and we'll be done. Okay, so those remaining jumper connections and 2.2 kilo ohm resistor over here are now all soldered on. Okay, you can see that on the top and the bottom, so all those connections are done. Okay, and then the next thing to do is to position in the terminals, those 5 terminals, the Huzzah board. Okay, and then the very last step, you should do this one last, is going to be to solder on the BME 280. Okay, and I'll show you why. So we're going to leave this one as the last step, and I'll show you everything else done prior to soldering that one on. Okay. For the terminals, these have 2 pins. They're fairly stiff. Okay, but they come originally they come straight. Okay, parallel to each other. I've bent these in because the spacing between these two is a little bit too wide for these standardized holes we have in these breadboards. Okay, so you may need to do that, and if you do it, when you do it, just be gentle and be careful not to break or shear off these pins. Okay. The other advice that I have is that for the Huzzah board, we don't need to solder all of these. Okay, so again, I ordered the configuration that has all of the header pins already connected and soldered in for us. If you buy the slightly cheaper one, which is fine as well, you will have to solder in your headers yourself. Okay, and that's just an extra step like we did already for the BME 280, as I showed you earlier. But regardless, you only need a few of these connections for this weather station configuration. So to help know which ones are necessary, it might be helpful in advance, because once you put it in, you may not be able to see all those pin connections so easily from the top, and you certainly can't see them from the bottom, because now we'll be operating on the bottom side of the breadboard. Okay, so to help yourself out in advance, I recommend, first of all, this first pin over here that's connected, this is the first connection hole that you have on the side, as we see it here. That is a reset pin. We won't be using that, and in fact, the way that we've laid out the board, we can't accommodate that pin sticking straight down, okay, as it comes in this configuration. So you have to bend that out to the side, and we'll trim that off later on, okay, or you can trim it off in advance, either one is fine. For the other ones, we're going to, if I flip this over, we'll need to connect to solder up, and let me do this so we can see it as we'll do it. Okay, so this is now the mirror image, but we'll need to solder connections to our 3-volt pin, our ground pin, and our ADC, or analog digital conversion connection pin. Okay, so the other ones we don't need on this particular side, which again is going to be facing us once we flip it back over again. Okay, so to help myself know which ones to solder, once I've put this in and I'm soldering on the bottom of the board, I've taken a marker, okay, and I've just put a little bit of marker on all those pins that I need to solder to, and so that I can see that once I'm soldering on the bottom side of the board. Okay, on the top side over here, which is now the side closest to me, as we flip it over, we need to make solder connections to the battery pin. Okay, that's that one there. Okay, to pin number 12 and pins 5 and 4 at the very end. Okay, so you can solder the other connections as well if you want more mechanical stability, but it's not a requirement for the electrical connections here for this board. Okay. So I'll go ahead and place all those in, the terminal and the huzzah. I'll solder those up, and then I'll show you what we'll do with the BME280 as our final step here. Okay, another point to emphasize prior to soldering up these terminals is which way that the open faces for where you're going to eventually insert your wires, okay, and then clamp them down via the Phillips head screw. Okay, so this screw here just drives a connection down to clamp the wire that you'll eventually put into each of these open terminals. Okay, so it's important to make sure that the terminals are facing in the right direction. Okay, so once you lay it all out, hopefully that'll be clear enough anyway, but we've got these 4 terminals on this bottom half of the board, 1 terminal on the top. And particularly for the bottom half, it's important that all the terminals face towards our power connections here, the plus and minus, if you want a direction there to orient. Okay, so they need to be away from the huzzah board, which will eventually go just behind it or on top of it over here. Okay, otherwise we won't have the space to make those to plug in those wires and connect those wires that eventually will connect to the rest of our components in the board. On the top here, this top terminal here, which in the diagram I've labeled as T5, it can go really in either direction, but just to make sure you have enough working space when you eventually connect everything together, it's probably best to have it facing out to the right for this open terminal connections, so you have more working space to plug in those wires and screw them down. Okay, so it's probably best to have it in the configuration here that I show you. Okay, if you can't get the terminal flush with the board, don't stress too much. We do have a lot of things connecting here in a small, cramped amount of space. Okay, so do your best to position it, and then once you solder it, that will hold everything in place. Okay, if you can get it flush, that's great. If you can't, don't stress too much about it.